The air in the 80-floor boardroom of St. James Global was thin, not from the altitude of the Manhattan skyline, but from the sheer vacuum of power created by Genevieve St. James. At 55, Genevieve did not merely enter a room, she reclaimed it. Her suit was a deep, predatory plum, tailored so sharply it looked like it could draw blood. She stood at the head of the obsidian table, her dark skin glowing against the backdrop of the setting sun, her silver-streaked hair coiled into a crown that signaled both her age and her untouchable status. "I don't care if he's a legacy hire," Genevieve said, her voice a low melodic rasp that made the junior executives break into a cold sweat. "I am not in the business of archiving history. I'm in the business of writing it. Fire him. Liquidate the European holdings by dawn. And someone get me a decent espresso? This tastes like compromise." She didn't wait for a response. She didn't need one. She was the lioness of the East River, a woman who had survived 3 recessions, 2 marriages, and 1,000 attempts to shrink her into a box. She walked to the floor-to-ceiling glass, looking out over the city she had conquered, her reflection staring back with eyes that were tired but fiercely bright. Halfway across the world, in a sleek subterranean gym in Seoul's Gangnam district, the sound of steel clashing against steel echoed like a heartbeat. Lee Dong-Wook moved with a grace that defied his 53 years. To the public, he was the billionaire king of venture, the man whose signatures birthed unicorns. But here, behind the mesh of a fencing mask, he was simply a blade. His opponent, a 24-year-old Olympic hopeful, lunged with the frantic energy of youth. Dong-Wook didn't retreat. He parried, a tiny surgical flick of the wrist, and thrust. The electronic beep signaled his point. Match. Dong-Wook pulled off his mask, revealing a face that was a map of disciplined elegance. His hair was thick, swept back, and his eyes held the stillness of a deep well. "You're too fast," the younger man panted, leaning on his knees. "No," Dong-Wook replied, his voice calm and melodic. "You are just too loud. You move before you think. In fencing, as in the market, the man who speaks first loses. The man who strikes last wins." His phone buzzed on a nearby bench, a secure message from the Global Consortium. His expression didn't change, but his grip on the foil tightened. The lioness was calling, or rather, the world was forcing them into the same cage. The Zurich Summit, 3 days later. The atmosphere in the private wing of the Dolder Grand was suffocating. The consortium, a group of faceless institutional investors who held the strings of the global tech market, had laid out the terms. A volatile AI bubble was about to burst in Europe, threatening to take down both Jen's media empire and Dong-Wook's tech holdings. "We are mandating a sovereign partnership," the lead arbiter said, "a month-long residency, one vision, one strategy. If the two of you cannot stabilize the market together, we will pull our liquidity from both your firms." Genevieve sat across from Dong-Wook, her legs crossed, a glass of vintage Bordeaux in her hand. She looked at him, the man she had outbid for a telecom giant in 2008, the man who had sued her over intellectual property in 2015, the man who had haunted the periphery of her respect for 20 years. "A partnership?" Genevieve laughed, the sound dry and dangerous. "I'd sooner partner with a cobra." "The cobra is a predictable creature, Genevieve," Dong-Wook said, his English perfect, his tone infuriatingly smooth. "I, however, have always found your scorched earth policy a bit primitive. It lacks the elegance of a long-term play." "Primitive?" Genevieve leaned forward, her eyes flashing. "While you were playing elegant chess in Seoul, I was building a fortress. I don't need a partner. I need people to stay out of my way." "The market doesn't care about your ego," Dong-Wook countered, standing up. He adjusted his cufflinks, his gaze meeting hers with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. "And neither do I. But I do care about my legacy. If that means enduring a month in the mountains with the most stubborn woman in the Western Hemisphere, I will survive it. The Swiss Alps. The helicopter dropped them at the edge of a brutalist masterpiece, a sprawling estate of raw concrete, floor-to-ceiling glass, and sharp angles carved into the side of a jagged Swiss peak. It was cold, magnificent, and isolated. As the rotors died down, the silence of the Alps rushed in. They entered the foyer, followed by a silent staff who deposited their trunks and vanished. The interior was a minimalist dream. Gray stone, black leather, and fires that roared in open pits. 1 month, Genevieve muttered, checking her Rolex. I'll give it 48 hours before one of us is pushed off a balcony. I've survived your lawsuits, Genevieve. I can survive a balcony, Dong-Wook said, walking toward the grand staircase. They reached the upper landing. At the end of the hall sat the master suite, a palatial room with a circular bed, a private terrace, and a fireplace made of obsidian. It was the only room in the house that offered a 360-degree view of the mountain range. They reached the door at the exact same time. I'll take this one, Genevieve said, her hand already on the handle. It wasn't a request. It was an executive order. Dong-Wook didn't move. He stood close enough that she could smell the faint, expensive scent of sandalwood and cold air clinging to his coat. The guest wing is perfectly suited for your needs, Genevieve. I require the height of this room for my morning meditation. It is essential for my process. Your process? Genevieve scoffed, turning her full body to face him, her chest inches from his. I am a 55-year-old woman who has earned the right to the best view in the house. I don't do guest wings. I am the host of my own life. And I, Dong-Wook said, his voice dropping an octave, his gaze dropping briefly to her lips before snapping back to her eyes, am a man who does not yield, not to boards, not to competitors, and certainly not to a woman simply because she has a louder roar. They stood there in the dim light of the hallway, two titans of industry, two legends who had spent their lives being the sun that others revolved around. For the first time in decades, neither of them was moving. I'm not moving my bags, Dong-Wook, she whispered, her defiance vibrating in the air. Then it seems, he replied, his hand covering hers on the doorknob. We have reached our first stalemate. Shall we see who breaks first? The mountain wind howled against the glass, but inside the air was beginning to burn. The dining room of the Swiss estate was a cathedral of glass and shadow. A table of reclaimed oak, long enough to seat 20, held only 2 place settings at opposite ends. Between them sat a collection of architectural candles and a bottle of 1996 Chateau Latour, a vintage as complex and expensive as the 2 people staring at one another across the expanse. Genevieve had changed into a floor-length silk slip dress the color of midnight, paired with a heavy gold chain that rested against the hollow of her throat. She looked less like a CEO and more like a deity demanding a sacrifice. Dong-Wook sat in a crisp white shirt, the top buttons undone, his sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that still held the corded muscle of an athlete. He poured the wine with a steady hand. 96, Jen noted, her voice echoing in the minimalist space. The year you tried to block my acquisition of the Caribbean satellite array, you nearly bankrupted my father's legacy company. Dong-Wook swirled his glass, the dark liquid catching the firelight. I didn't try to block you, Genevieve. I tried to save you from a bad investment. The infrastructure was crumbling. You were sentimental. Sentiment is the rust of the soul. I turned that rust into a $4 billion profit within 3 years, she shot back, taking a slow, deliberate sip, while you were busy licking your wounds in Singapore. I wasn't licking wounds. I was sharpening my blade. He leaned back, his dark eyes tracing the lines of her face. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was heavy with the weight of 2 decades of tactical warfare. Do you remember London? he asked softly. 98? The rainy night at the Dorchester? London, 1998. The rain had been a relentless gray curtain over Mayfair. Inside the ballroom, the air smelled of expensive cigars and desperation. Genevieve, younger and radiating a hunger that terrified the older men in the room, stood by the bar. She was the only black woman in a sea of beige, her eyes scanning the room for the mark. Then she saw him. Lee Dong-Wook was younger, a prodigy from Seoul who had just executed a hostile takeover that made the Financial Times tremble. He approached her not with a business card, but with a question. "You're going for the Thames development rights," he'd said, his voice barely a whisper against the gala's roar. "Don't. The soil is contaminated. The government is sitting on the report." Genevieve had stiffened, her pride flaring. And why would a competitor tell me that? To clear the path for himself? "Because," he'd said, looking at her with a terrifyingly clear intensity, "it would be a waste to see a mine like yours buried in a landfill. I'd rather beat you when you're at your strongest." She hadn't listened. She'd outbid him by 50 million, won the rights, and spent the next 2 years and $100 million cleaning up the mess. It was the only time she'd ever been truly played. Not by him, but by her own refusal to believe he could be honest. The present. The Alps. "I hated you for that," Genevieve said, the memory tasting like copper. "I thought it was a double bluff. I thought you were playing the gentleman to distract me from the kill." "I was never playing, Genevieve," Dong-Wook replied. He stood up, walking the length of the table until he was standing just behind her chair. He didn't touch her, but his presence was a heat she felt in her marrow. "I have spent 20 years watching you. I watched you marry that politician in Paris, a man who didn't deserve to hold your coat. I watched you divorce him and take half his state. I watched you become the lioness." Genevieve tilted her head back, looking up at him. The boss in her wanted to snap at him for the intrusion, but the woman in her, the one who hadn't been touched with reverence in years, wanted to see how far he would go. "And what did you see, Dong-Wook? Besides a rival?" "I saw someone who was as tired of winning as I am," he whispered. "Someone who has everything, yet looks at the horizon like there's a piece of the world still missing." Genevieve stood abruptly, her silk dress whispering against her skin. She turned to face him, her nose inches from his. "Don't psychoanalyze me. You don't have the clearance." "Then let's settle it the old way," he said, a challenge sparking in his eyes. "You want the master suite? You want the lead on the European merger? You want to prove that you are the unstoppable St. James?" He stepped back, gesturing toward the stairs that led to the lower level. "The gym has a regulation fencing strip. Foil, AP, or saber. I know you took it up in your 30s to de-stress. Let's see if you've actually learned how to strike, or if you've just been hitting straw men." Genevieve's blood hummed. It was an absurd proposition. Two of the world's most powerful people settling a billion-dollar dynamic with cold steel in the middle of a Swiss night. But it was the only thing that made sense. "I'm going to humiliate you, Dong-Wook," she said, her voice dropping to a predatory purr. "Many have tried," he smiled, and for the first time, it wasn't a corporate mask. It was the smile of a man who had finally found a worthy opponent. "I'll meet you downstairs. Wear something you don't mind getting sweat on." "Don't worry about me," Genevieve said, walking past him toward the door. "Just make sure your medical insurance is up to date." The gym was a cathedral of brushed steel and white light, tucked into the subterranean belly of the estate. At its center lay the piste, a long metallic strip that felt like a runway to a collision. Genevieve stepped onto the mat, the white fencing knickers and jacket hugging her curves with a utilitarian tightness. She tucked her mask under her arm, her dark skin glistening under the fluorescent lights. Across from her, Dong-Wook was already wired into the electronic scoring system. He looked like a statue carved from salt and shadow, his expression unreadable behind the mesh of his mask. "Standard rules?" she asked, her voice echoing. "Or are we playing for blood?" "In this house, Genevieve, there is no difference," Dong-Wook replied, his voice muffled but steady. They donned their masks. The world narrowed to the grid of the mesh and the rhythmic sound of their own breathing. En garde. The first engagement was a blur. Dong-Wook was a lightning strike, pure, explosive speed. He moved with the muscle memory of a man who had been a champion before he was a titan. He lunged, his foil a silver streak, but Genevieve wasn't there. She parried with a sharp metallic clink and retreated, her movements deliberate, feline. She knew she couldn't beat his reflex. She had to beat his mind. "You're rushing, Dong-Wook," she teased, her voice low as they circled each other. "Is the ideal son afraid of losing to a woman who didn't go to his prep school?" He didn't take the bait. He pressed forward, a flurry of disengages and ripostes that forced Jen to the very edge of the strip. Her heart was a drum against her ribs. The heat inside the suit was stifling, the scent of her own adrenaline sharp in her nose. He lunged again. Genevieve saw the opening, a tiny, arrogant tilt of his shoulder. She executed a perfect circular parry, her blade catching his and whipping it aside. She lunged, her point landing squarely on his chest. The electronic beep filled the room. 1-1, she breathed, her chest heaving. Dong-Wook stood at his full height, his silhouette imposing. Calculation over speed. Impressive. "I've spent 50 years being underestimated," she said. "It's my greatest asset." The match intensified. It became a conversation. A 20-year argument settled through friction. They were sweating now, the white jackets clinging to their backs. Every time they clashed, the vibration traveled up their arms, a physical jolt of connection. Finally, they were tied. The final point. They met in the center of the strip. Dong-Wook feinted high, then dropped low. Jen anticipated the move, but he was faster than she'd calculated. He didn't just lunge, he moved with a flesh, an all-out running attack. He hit his mark. The beep was final. The momentum carried him forward, and they collided. Jen lost her footing on the slick mat, and they went down together. Dong-Wook reacted instantly, twisting his body so he took the brunt of the fall on the hard floor, his arms wrapping around Genevieve to shield her. They landed with a heavy thud, the air leaving their lungs in a simultaneous gasp. For a long moment, neither moved. Dong-Wook reached up, his gloved hand trembling slightly as he pulled off his mask. Then he reached for hers, his fingers fumbling with the latch until the mesh was gone. Genevieve's face was inches from his. Her hair was damp, escaping its pins. Her eyes were wide, the pupils blown out from the exertion. Dong-Wook's face was flushed, a bead of sweat tracing the line of his jaw. The billionaire boss was gone. The cold fencer was gone. There was only a man, breathing the same air as the woman who had haunted his professional life for 2 decades. His hand stayed on the side of her neck, the thumb brushing the underside of her jaw. The proximity was electric, a magnetic pull that felt like it would crack the concrete floor beneath them. He didn't pull away. He looked at her with a raw, terrifying hunger, not just for her body, but for her soul. "You almost had me," he whispered, his voice ragged. "Almost isn't a victory," Genevieve replied, her voice a mere breath. She didn't move. She couldn't. The weight of him, the heat of him, was the only thing keeping her grounded. The silence was absolute, until it wasn't. A sharp, demanding electronic chirp cut through the tension. Dong-Wook's phone, left on a nearby bench, was screaming. The spell broke. Dong-Wook stiffened. His eyes, which had been soft and searching, suddenly shuddered. He sat up, helping Genevieve to her feet with a professional distance that felt like a slap. He walked to the bench. He didn't even have to look at the screen to know who it was. The ringtone was a specific, dissonant piece of classical piano. "Mother," he said, speaking in Korean. His voice had transformed. It was no longer the voice of a lion. It was the voice of a servant. It was flat, toneless, and heavy, with a weight that made his shoulders slump. Genevieve stood back, watching him. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. She watched the most powerful man in Seoul shrink. He stood perfectly straight, his face a mask of subservience, as the voice on the other end, even from 5 feet away, sounded shrill and unrelenting. "Yes," Dong-Wook said in Korean. "I understand. The family honor is paramount. I am doing exactly as instructed. No, there is no distraction." He looked at Genevieve then, and for a fleeting second, the mask slipped. She saw it. The exhaustion of a man who had spent 53 years playing a role he never chose. He wasn't just a billionaire. He was a prisoner of a legacy that didn't care if he was happy, only if he was perfect. He hung up and stared at the dark screen for a long time. "Everything all right?" Genevieve asked, her voice softer now, the competitive fire replaced by a strange new ache. Dong-Wook turned, his face once again an unreadable wall of granite. "Everything is exactly as it should be, Genevieve. Good night." He walked out, leaving her alone in the bright, cold gym. Genevieve looked down at her hand, which was still shaking. She had come here to win a merger. She realized, with a sinking feeling in her gut, that she was starting to want to save the man instead. The blue light of 4 different monitors bathed the stone walls of the study in a ghostly rhythmic pulse. Outside, the Swiss night was an infinite void of black and white, but inside, the air was vibrating with the frantic energy of a New York trading floor. Genevieve sat at the center of it, her hair pulled back. She was on a secure line, her voice a low, dangerous growl. "I don't care what the SEC says. If that memo leaked, it came from the inside. Find the leak, cauterize the wound, and buy back every share of St. James Media that hits the floor. Do you hear me? Every single one." She slammed the laptop shut, her breathing shallow. For the first time in a decade, she felt the walls closing in. A coordinated short attack was hitting her stock, fueled by a doctored whistleblower report claiming she was hiding massive losses in her streaming division. In Manhattan, she would have been in the war room, smelling the blood and the ink. Here, she was a lioness in a glass cage, 5,000 miles from the fight. "Your buyback strategy is a mistake." The voice came from the shadows by the fireplace. Dong-Wook was standing there, dressed in a black turtleneck, a tablet in his hand. He didn't look like he had been sleeping. He looked like he had been hunting. "I didn't invite you in here, Dong-Wook," Jen snapped, her eyes flashing, "and I certainly didn't ask for a consultation. Stay in your lane." "Your lane is currently underwater," he said, stepping into the light. He didn't offer a sympathetic smile. He didn't ask if she was okay. He looked at her screens with the cold, analytical eye of a man who had dismantled empires for breakfast. "You're playing defense. You're trying to protect your pride. In a short squeeze of this magnitude, pride is a liability." Genevieve stood up, her stature commanding even in her exhaustion. "This is my company. My name is on the building. And by dawn, that name will be worth 40% less if you keep trying to cauterize the wound," Dong-Wook countered. He walked to the main monitor, his fingers flying across the keys with a speed that mirrored his fencing. "Look at the trade volume. This isn't just a leak. It's a ghost protocol attack. They want you to spend your cash reserves on a buyback so they can trigger a margin call on your personal debt." Genevieve froze. She looked at the data he was pulling up. Dark pool trades she hadn't even seen yet. He was right. She had been so blinded by the insult of the attack that she'd missed the trap. "What would you do?" she asked, the words tasting like ash. Dong-Wook turned to her. His gaze was intense, devoid of pity, and entirely focused on her intellect. I wouldn't buy back a single share. I would let it drop. Let them think they've won. Then, I would use your European subsidiary to announce a surprise merger with my Busan tech group. It's a Trojan pivot. We don't defend the media wing. We transform it into a tech infrastructure giant overnight. The shorts will have to cover their positions at a price that will bankrupt them. Genevieve stared at the screen, her mind racing. It was ruthless. It was elegant. It was also a massive risk. It would link their companies legally before the sovereign partnership was even finalized. You'd put your own capital on the line for this? She asked. I don't do it for the capital, he said, stepping closer, his voice dropping to a low, resonant frequency. I do it because I want to see what happens when the two of us stop wasting our energy trying to destroy each other and start destroying the people who think we're vulnerable. Genevieve looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the ideal son who was tired of playing by the rules, and he saw the unstoppable woman who realized she didn't have to carry the world alone. Move over, she said, pulling a second chair to the desk. If we're going to bankrupt these bastards, we need to do it by sunrise. For the next 6 hours, the room became a vacuum. There was no Genevieve and Dong-Wook, no Black or Korean, no New York or Seoul. There were only two master tacticians operating in a state of perfect flow. They worked in a shared language of numbers and leverage. Dong-Wook handled the Asian markets as they opened. Genevieve dictated the narrative for the morning news cycle, her voice steady and lethal as she leaked counterintelligence that made the shorts panic. At one point, around 4 a.m., their hands brushed as they both reached for the same tablet. Neither pulled away. The contact was a grounding wire, a silent acknowledgement that they were the only two people in the world who could keep up with each other. Coffee? He asked, not breaking his gaze from a fluctuating candlestick chart. Black, like my soul, she joked, her first real smile of the night ghosting across her lips. He didn't just bring her coffee, he brought her a piece of dark chocolate from the kitchen. For the endorphins, he said simply. We have 20 minutes before the London Exchange opens. As the first sliver of gray light touched the peaks of the Alps, the final trade went through. The short sellers were caught in a vice. St. James Media didn't just stabilize, it surged. Genevieve leaned back in her chair, her eyes burning, her body aching, but her spirit soaring. She looked at the man beside her. He was leaning back too, his sleeves rolled up, a smudge of ink on his jaw. We did it, she whispered. We decimated them, he corrected. They sat in the silence of the dawn, the blue light of the monitors finally fading against the natural sun. The professional facade hadn't just cracked. It had been replaced by something much more dangerous. Trust. Genevieve realized then that she wasn't just addicted to the power. She was becoming addicted to the way he saw her power. Not as something to be tamed, but as something to be celebrated. Dong-Wook? Yes, Genevieve? About that master suite. He looked at her, his dark eyes sparkling with a rare, genuine warmth. I think, after a night like this, we both know that neither of us is going to be sleeping in the guest wing. The air in the room shifted, the tension of the market replaced by a tension that was far more volatile. The invitation had specified black tie and masks, a requirement that Genevieve found both redundant and poetic. In her world, every day was a masquerade. She stood before the antique mirror in her suite, adjusting the emerald-cut diamonds at her ears. Her gown was a masterpiece of sculptural silk in a shade of deep midnight violet that turned her skin to polished mahogany. It didn't just fit her. It clung to her with the same tenacity she applied to a hostile takeover. At 55, she had no interest in hiding her age. The fine lines at the corners of her eyes were maps of every war she'd won. A knock at the door, firm, rhythmic. She opened it to find Dong-Wook. He was a vision of severe, devastating elegance in a midnight blue velvet tuxedo. He held a hand-carved Venetian mask in one hand, but it was his face that arrested her. He wasn't looking at her the way the men in Manhattan did, with a mix of fear and greed. He was looking at her like she was a masterpiece he had finally been given permission to study. "Genevieve," he said, his voice a low, resonant hum, "you look sovereign." "And you look like you're about to buy the Swiss National Bank," she countered, though her heart did a traitorous roll in her chest. "Shall we go give them the show they paid for?" The gala was held in a 19th century manor overlooking Lake Zurich, a place where the air smelled of old money and cold champagne. As they entered, the room, filled with the elite of Europe, seemed to tilt on its axis. They were the sovereign partnership, the two titans who had just saved the tech market from a nosedive. For 3 hours, they played the role with a terrifying, synchronized precision. When a German industrialist tried to talk over Genevieve, Dong-Wook simply stepped into the man's space, his silence more deafening than any retort, until the man faltered. When a young socialite tried to flatter Dong-Wook, Genevieve reclaimed his attention with a single, sharp sentence that reminded everyone in the room exactly who held the keys to the kingdom. But it was during the keynote speech that the mask truly slipped. Not for the public, but for Genevieve. She was standing on a small dais, addressing the room about the future of a global philanthropy. She was magnetic, her voice carrying the weight of decades of authority. Usually when she spoke, she watched the audience's reactions to gauge her leverage. Tonight, she only watched Dong-Wook. He was leaning against a marble pillar at the edge of the crowd, a glass of untouched scotch in his hand. He wasn't networking. He wasn't checking his phone. He was watching her. It wasn't the gaze of a business partner. It was the intense, focused heat of a man who found her mind more intoxicating than the wine. Every time she made a point, his lips would curve just a fraction of a millimeter. A private, silent applause. When she stepped down, the applause of the room was a dull roar compared to the electricity of him walking toward her. "We're leaving," he whispered in her ear, his breath warm against her neck. "The performance is over. I find I have a sudden distaste for sharing you with a room full of strangers." The drive back to the estate was a study in sensory deprivation. The interior of the car was hushed, the only sound the soft hiss of tires on the snowy alpine roads. Outside, the world was a blur of white. Inside, the air was thick enough to choke on. Genevieve sat in the corner of the leather seat, her mask discarded, her head resting back. "You were quite the diplomat tonight, Dong-Wook. I almost believed you liked those people." "I don't like anyone, Genevieve. You know that," he said, staring out the window, his profile etched in the passing moonlight. "I like results. I like efficiency. And I like the way you made that French minister look like a schoolboy when he questioned your logistics." Genevieve laughed, a soft, tired sound. 20 years of fighting you, and now you're my biggest fan? It's a bit of a pivot, don't you think?" "It's not a pivot," he said, turning to her. The distance between them in the back seat felt like a canyon and a hair's breadth all at once. "It's a realization. For 20 years, I fought you because you were the only person who could actually keep up with me. I thought it was professional rivalry. I was wrong." Genevieve's breath hitched. She shifted, her silk dress rustling in the silence. What was it then? Dong-Wook moved. He didn't rush. He was a man of 53 who knew the power of a slow, deliberate move. He leaned into her space, his hand coming up to rest on the leather behind her head. "It was an obsession," he confessed, his voice dropping to a gravelly, raw register. "I didn't want to beat you, Genevieve. I wanted to be the only one you were looking at when you won. I wanted to see the lioness roar and know that I was the only one she let close enough to touch." Genevieve's heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She should make a joke. She should call him out on his elegant words. But she looked into his eyes, the eyes of a man who had been a ghost to her for 2 decades, and she saw her own loneliness reflected back. We are too old for games, Dong-Wook, she whispered, her hand rising to touch the velvet of his lapel. I am finished with games, he said. He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw, his thumb brushing over her lower lip. I have the world. I have the legacy. But I have spent every night of my life in an empty room, wondering if there was anyone who didn't want something from me, but simply wanted me. He leaned in closer, his forehead resting against hers. I look at you and I see a woman who doesn't need my billions. She doesn't need my protection. But God, she is the only person I have ever met who makes me feel like I don't have to be the king for a few hours. Then don't be, Genevieve breathed. She closed the gap. The kiss wasn't the tentative fumbling of youth. It was the heavy, desperate collision of two adults who had waited 20 years to find out what the other tasted like. It tasted of expensive scotch, dark chocolate, and a decade of suppressed fire. When they finally pulled apart, the car was pulling into the estate's courtyard. The headlights caught the falling snow, turning it into a shower of diamonds. Dong-Wook didn't let go of her hand. His grip was firm, possessive, and for the first time in Genevieve Street James's life, she didn't feel the need to lead. The master suite, she asked, her voice steady but her eyes burning. The master suite, he agreed. The storm didn't just arrive, it laid siege to the mountain. By midnight, the brutalist glass walls of the estate offered no view, only a terrifying, opaque whiteness that rattled the frames. Then, with a structural groan and a sudden, violent snap of silence, the power died. The emergency lights cast a weak, amber glow through the corridors, but in the main library there was only the dying pulse of the fireplace. Genevieve stood by the hearth, her silhouette a sharp, restless line against the fading embers. She was wrapped in a heavy cashmere robe, but she was shivering, not from the cold, but from the sudden, forced stillness. For a woman who lived by the second, silence was an insult. You're pacing again, Genevieve. Dong-Wook's voice drifted from the shadows of a wingback chair. He sounded infuriatingly calm. The blizzard won't move faster because you're impatient. I'm not impatient. I'm calculating the cost of every hour we're disconnected, she snapped, turning to face the darkness where he sat. My board is likely drafting a coup while I'm trapped in a frozen tomb with a man who thinks power is a meditation exercise. And you think power is a loud noise, he countered. He rose, the firelight catching the sharp planes of his face as he stepped toward her. You think if you aren't screaming at the world, it will forget you exist. It's a very American delusion. It's not a delusion, it's a survival tactic. Genevieve stepped into his space, her eyes burning. I am a black woman who built a kingdom in a world that wanted me to be the help. If I stop moving, if I stop asserting my noise, they don't just forget me. They erase me. You wouldn't understand that. You were born into the gravity of a legacy. You just had to keep the throne warm. Dong-Wook flinched, a rare crack in his porcelain composure. Keep the throne warm? I have spent 53 years being a ghost in my own life. I was a son before I was a boy, and a chairman before I was a man. My power isn't a survival tactic, Genevieve. It's a gilded cage. I don't move because if I do, I break the tradition that sustains 10,000 families. You think you're the only one who feels the weight of the world. Then let it break, she shouted, her hand landing hard on his chest, her fingers bunching in the fabric of his shirt. Stop being the ideal son for 5 minutes and be the man who sat across from me in London 20 years ago, the man who wanted to beat me because he saw me as his only equal. I am that man, he roared back, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. He grabbed her wrists, his grip firm but not bruising. Why do you think I'm here? Why do you think I let the consortium trap me in the Alps? I didn't need this merger. I needed you. I needed the only person on this planet who looks at me and doesn't see a bank account or a title, but a man who is just as exhausted and just as hungry as she is. The air between them was no longer cold. It was combustible. The boss personas, the carefully curated masks of the media mogul and the tech giant, shattered under the pressure of 20 years of repressed friction. Genevieve didn't pull away. She leaned in, her forehead pressing against his. Then stop talking about the world, Dong-Wook. The world is outside in the snow. Right here, there is nothing but us. The kiss wasn't a beginning. It was an explosion. It was the desperate, starving collision of two people who had spent their lives being strong for everyone else. Dong-Wook's hands moved to her waist, pulling her flush against him with a ferocity that made Genevieve gasp. They stumbled back toward the oversized leather sofa by the fire. There was no grace in the movement, only a primal, urgent need to be felt. As they moved together, the reality of their ages, the beautiful, heavy truth of being over 50, wasn't a hindrance. It was a revelation. "I am not a girl," Genevieve whispered against his throat as he pushed the cashmere from her shoulders. "I have scars, Dong-Wook. I have a history that shows on my skin." "And I am not a prince," he replied, his voice a ragged growl. He pulled back for a second, his eyes tracing the curve of her neck, the silver at her temples, the unapologetic strength of her body. "I don't want a girl. I want the woman who fought me for 2 decades. I want every year you've lived. I want the geology of you." When they finally touched, skin to skin, it was with a raw honesty that younger lovers couldn't possibly understand. There was no performance here. They weren't trying to impress. They were trying to survive. Genevieve felt the solid, enduring strength of his frame, a man who had maintained his body like a temple for a god he no longer worshipped. Dong-Wook felt the velvet heat of her, the confidence in her touch that only came from a woman who knew exactly who she was and what she deserved. In the flickering orange light of the dying fire, they unmade each other. Every sigh was a surrender of a corporate secret. Every touch was a hostile takeover of the heart. For the first time in their lives, they weren't the ones in control. Later, as the storm continued to howl outside, they lay tangled in a heap of wool blankets on the rug. The fire was nearly out, and the room was freezing, but they were radiating a heat that felt permanent. Genevieve rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady, powerful rhythm of his heart. "If the board saw me now," she murmured, a trace of her old humor returning. "They wouldn't recognize you," Dong-Wook said, his arm tightening around her, his fingers tracing the line of her spine. "They've never seen you when you aren't at war." "I'm still at war," Genevieve said, lifting her head to look at him, her eyes soft but resolute. "But for the first time, I think I found someone worth being in the trenches with." Dong-Wook kissed her forehead, the gesture surprisingly tender after the violence of their passion. "The storm will break tomorrow, Genevieve, and the world will expect us to be the people we were yesterday." "Let them expect it," Genevieve said, leaning down to reclaim his lips. "But we'll know better. We aren't a partnership, Dong-Wook. We're an empire." The morning light did not so much break as it did invade. The snowstorm had passed, leaving behind a world so blindingly white it felt like a sterile interrogation room. Genevieve was awake before the sun touched the peaks. She stood in the center of the master suite, already armored in a charcoal gray power suit that fit like a second skin. Her hair was slicked back into a knot so tight it pulled at her temples. She was staring at her reflection, applying a layer of deep, matte red lipstick with the precision of a surgeon. Behind her, on the sprawling circular bed, Dong-Wook stirred. The blankets were a chaotic map of the night they had just shared, a night of salt, heat, and the kind of truth that usually destroyed people in their tax bracket. He sat up, his chest bare, his hair disheveled. He looked at her back, his eyes soft with a lingering warmth he hadn't felt in decades. "Genevieve," he said, his voice a low morning rasp. "You're up early." Genevieve didn't turn around. She clicked her lipstick shut, The sound was as sharp as a gunshot. The satellite uplink is back. I have a 7 a.m. briefing with New York. We lost 6 hours of market positioning during the storm. We're behind. The warmth in the room evaporated. Dong-Wook felt the shift, the sudden glacial wall she had erected between the bed and the mirror. The market didn't move that much, Genevieve, he said, swinging his legs out of bed. He walked toward her, but she stepped to the side to reach for her briefcase, avoiding his touch. Last night, that wasn't about market positioning. Last night was a biological necessity exacerbated by a weather event, Genevieve said, her voice clipped and professional. She finally looked at him, but her eyes were like two pieces of flint. It was refreshing. But let's not confuse a lapse in discipline with a change in strategy. Dong-Wook stopped. The ideal son in him, the man who had been trained to read subtext in the slightest twitch of a diplomat's eye, saw exactly what was happening. She was terrified. She had given him the one thing she never gave anyone: vulnerability. And now she was trying to buy it back with coldness. A lapse in discipline? He repeated, his own voice hardening. Is that what you call it when you look a man in the eye and tell him you've been lonely for 20 years? I was speaking under duress, she snapped. She walked toward the door, her heels clicking, a rhythmic, aggressive beat against the stone floor. I'll be in the study. We have the draft for the sovereign merger to finalize. I suggest you get dressed. Chairman Ko is expecting a status report on your family's interests by noon. The day became a masterpiece of passive-aggressive warfare. They sat in the library, the long oak table between them once again. But today, the distance felt wider than the ocean. Genevieve was a machine. She fired off emails, took 3 conference calls, and redlined the merger documents with a ruthlessness that made the legal team in London weep. Every time Dong-Wook tried to catch her eye, she looked through him. Every time he offered a suggestion that was even remotely collaborative, she treated it like a hostile bid. If we structure the Busan holding this way, Dong-Wook said, pointing to a diagram, it protects my mother's legacy shares, but gives you more voting power in the tech division. I don't need you to give me power, Dong-Wook, Genevieve said, not looking up from her tablet. And I don't care about your mother's shares. If she wants to protect her legacy, she can come to the table herself. Or are you still her proxy? The insult hit exactly where she knew it would. Dong-Wook slammed his laptop shut. You're trying to provoke me, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. You're trying to make me angry so you can justify going back to the way things were. You're scared that if you're human with me, you'll lose your edge. I'm scared of being stupid, Genevieve shot back, finally standing up. She leaned across the table, her face inches from his. I am 55 years old, Dong-Wook. I have spent 30 years building a wall so high that no one can climb it. Last night, I let you in through the back gate, and all I can think about this morning is how easily you could burn the whole place down from the inside. I don't want to burn it down, he roared, standing to meet her. I want to live in it with you. Do you have any idea what I've done this morning? While you were busy pretending I didn't exist, I sent a message to my family's council. I told them the Busan expansion is being led by St. James Media. My mother is currently having a stroke in Seoul because I've chosen a black woman's vision over her pure legacy. Genevieve blinked. The unstoppable CEO facade wavered for a fraction of a second. You did what? I chose you, Dong-Wook whispered, the weight of the sacrifice hanging in the air. I am willing to let them strip me of my titles. I am willing to be the disappointment if it means I don't have to spend another 20 years fighting the only person who makes me feel alive. But I can't be the only one standing on this side of the line. Genevieve looked at him, and for a moment the room was silent. She saw the cost of his choice, the isolation, the loss of the only world he had ever known. He was offering her the ultimate leverage, his own destruction, and she hated him for it, because it meant she had to choose too. You shouldn't have done that, she said, her voice trembling with a mix of fury and grief. Why? Because it makes it real? Because I didn't ask you to be a martyr, she cried. She turned away from him, clutching her own arms as if to keep herself from falling apart. I don't know how to be a partner, Dong-Wook. I only know how to be a sovereign. Then you're going to be a very lonely queen, he said. He walked out of the study, the heavy oak door swinging shut with a finality that felt like the end of the world. Genevieve stood in the center of the room, surrounded by her monitors, her data, and her power. For the first time in her life, the empire she had built felt like a very small, very cold room. She reached out and touched the red lipstick on her desk, her hand shaking. The strategy had worked. She had pushed him away. She had protected her heart. She had never felt more like she was losing. The silence that followed their Cold War was broken not by a word, but by the rhythmic, mechanical thrum of a helicopter blade cutting through the thin alpine air. Genevieve stood at the window of the study, her arms crossed tightly over her charcoal suit. She watched as a sleek, matte black Augusta Westland touched down on the estate's private pad. A woman stepped out, wrapped in a coat of cream-colored cashmere so fine it looked like liquid, her movements possessing a choreographed, ancestral stillness. "Who is she, Dong-Wook?" Genevieve asked, her voice a low vibration. Dong-Wook stood behind her, his body rigid. He didn't need to look. He recognized the silhouette, the posture, the very air of command she carried. "Park Mi-kyung," he said, his voice devoid of emotion, "the CEO of Shinhwa Logistics, and for 12 years, my wife." Genevieve felt a cold prickle of electricity move down her spine. "I knew you were married. I didn't know you were still in business with the ghost of your past." "Our divorce was a corporate restructuring, Genevieve, not an ending," he replied, already moving toward the door, his face settling into that stony, impenetrable mask she had fought so hard to break the night before. The meeting in the Grand Salon was a study in cultural friction. Park Mi-kyung was 52, with skin like porcelain and eyes that held the weight of 500 years of dynastic expectation. She sat on the edge of the leather sofa, her tea held in a way that signaled a perfectly engineered upbringing. When she spoke, her voice was a soft, melodic weapon. "Dong-Wook ah," she began in Korean, her tone intimate yet formal. She didn't acknowledge Genevieve at first, a slight that was so subtle, it was masterful. "The council is in an uproar. Your message about the St. James merger, it was seen as a declaration of war against your own blood." Dong-Wook sat opposite her, his posture shifting. He wasn't the man who had roared at Genevieve in the library. He was the chairman. He was the son. "It is a strategic pivot, Mi-kyung. The council will see the value when the margins come in." "The council does not care about margins when the chairman is being led by a foreign influence," Mi-kyung replied, her eyes finally flitting to Genevieve. She switched to English, her accent refined and sharp. "Forgive me, Miss St. James. In our world, business and blood are the same thread. When one is pulled, the whole tapestry unspools." Genevieve sat in a high-backed chair, her presence a dark, bold contrast to Mi-kyung's pale elegance. She didn't lean in. She didn't have to. "In my world, Miss Park, blood is just a biological reality. Business is about vision. If Dong-Wook's council is afraid of a little foreign brilliance, then perhaps they've outlived their own relevance." Mi-kyung's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Brilliance is common. Longevity is rare. Dong-Wook and I were built for longevity. We were raised to understand that our desires are secondary to the institution." She looked at Dong-Wook, her voice softening. "You remember the price we paid, don't you? The years of silence? You cannot throw that away for a midlife rebellion." Genevieve watched them. She saw the way Dong-Wook didn't contradict her. She saw the shared history in the way they moved, a shorthand of bows and honorifics, a language of duty that she could never speak. It triggered the one thing Genevieve St. James never felt, The sensation of being an intruder. She was the lioness of New York, but here, in the shadow of this 1,000-year-old expectation, she felt like a guest who had stayed too long. I am not a rebellion, Mi-kyung, Dong-Wook said, but he said it in Korean. Genevieve felt the wall slam shut. It wasn't just the language, it was the atmosphere. They were a closed circuit. She watched as Dong-Wook navigated the traditional expectations, the way he lowered his voice, the way he deferred to the proper way of handling Xinhua logistics. He was being the ideal son, again, right in front of her. I need a moment with my partner, Genevieve said, her voice cutting through the Korean dialogue like a blade. Mi-kyung stood, smoothing her coat. Of course. I will be in the dining room. I've brought a chef from Seoul. I assumed, Dong-Wook, that you would be tired of heavy mountain food. Once the door clicked shut, the silence in the room was suffocating. You went back to it, Genevieve said, her voice trembling with a rare, raw anger. The second she walked in, you became a ghost again. I am managing a crisis, Genevieve. Dong-Wook turned, his eyes flashing with frustration. She represents the other half of my voting bloc. If I don't handle her with the proper respect, she will join the council and strip me of everything by sunset. It's not about the voting bloc, Dong-Wook. It's the way you look at her. It's the way you don't look at me when she's in the room. Genevieve walked toward him, her heels echoing on the stone. I have spent my life being the other, the only black woman in the boardroom, the only woman in the room, the only one who didn't belong. I am 55 years old, and I am too tired to play that role in my own heart. You belong with me, he said, reaching for her hand. Genevieve pulled back. Do I? Look at us. You're a prince of a dynasty that views me as a foreign influence. I'm a woman who won't bow to your mother or your ex-wife or your council. Every time you speak Korean to her, you are reminding me that there is a part of your soul I will never have access to. That is my culture, not a secret. It's a world that doesn't have a place for me, she whispered, the vulnerability of the morning finally breaking through. I saw the way you looked when she talked about longevity. You looked like you were being pulled back into the dark. And I realized, I don't know if I can pull hard enough to keep you in the light. Genevieve, go eat your dinner, Dong-Wook, she said, turning her back to him. Go be the chairman. Go be the ideal son. I have work to do. As he left the room, his footsteps heavy and hesitant, Genevieve looked out at the Swiss peaks. She had built an empire of media and truth, but as she watched the black helicopter idling on the snow, she realized that some narratives were too old to be rewritten, and some ghosts were too strong to be outrun. The sound of the suitcase zipper was a sharp, decisive rasp that cut through the silence of the master suite like a guillotine. Genevieve didn't look at the bed. She didn't look at the fireplace where, only 48 hours ago, she had let a man see the girl she used to be before the world forced her to become a monument. She moved with military precision, folding her silk blouses and stowing her heels, each movement a brick being laid back into the wall she had spent her life building. The kingmaker doesn't need a king, she told herself, the mantra drumming in her head. She creates them. She destroys them. She does not marry them. She reached for her coat, a structured obsidian cashmere, and slung it over her shoulders. She looked at her reflection one last time. The silver at her temples looked like a crown. The red on her lips was a warning. She was Genevieve St. James again, the lioness, untouchable. She walked out of the suite, her heels clicking against the stone floor with a finality that echoed through the hollow halls of the estate. She didn't call for the staff. She would carry her own weight, just as she always had. She reached the grand foyer, the massive steel doors of the estate looming ahead. But she wasn't alone. Dong-Wook was standing by the door, but he wasn't blocking it with his body. He was leaning against the wall, his arms crossed, a practice foil held loosely in his right hand. He wasn't wearing his suit. He was in his black fencing gear, the jacket unzipped to reveal the damp white shirt beneath. He looked weary, but his eyes were sharper than she had ever seen them. "The helicopter isn't due for 20 minutes, Genevieve," he said, his voice a low, steady vibration. "Are you retreating, or just forfeiting the match?" "I'm finishing the residency," Genevieve said, her grip tightening on the handle of her suitcase. "The merger documents are signed. The market has stabilized. There is nothing left for me here but a language I don't speak and a past I'm not invited to." Dong-Wook stepped away from the wall, the tip of his foil tracing a small, circular pattern on the floor. In fencing, the most dangerous move isn't the lunge, it's the retreat. You think by moving backward, you are safe, but all you're doing is giving your opponent the space to finish the kill. "I am not your opponent, Dong-Wook. I'm your partner, and partners know when a venture has reached its expiration date." "You're lying," he said, stepping closer. He didn't touch her, but he used the foil to gently bar her path, the blunt tip resting against the center of her chest, right over her heart. "This isn't about Mi-kyung. This isn't about soul. This is about the fact that for the first time in 30 years, you met someone who didn't blink when you roared, and it terrified you." Genevieve's eyes flashed. "Move the blade, Dong-Wook." "Parry me then," he challenged, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You spent 20 years parrying my bids, my lawsuits, and my charm. Why stop now? Because you're afraid if you stay, you might actually have to live for yourself instead of for your empire." "I am my empire," she shouted, the sound echoing off the brutalist concrete. "No," he said, and for the first time his voice broke. He lowered the foil, his hand trembling. "You are the woman who makes me feel like I'm not a ghost. You think you're leaving because you don't belong in my world? Genevieve, I've been waiting 20 years for a world that was big enough for both of us. My life and soul, the ideal son, the perfect chairman. It was a tomb. It was silent." He took a step into her personal space, the scent of his exertion and the cold alpine air surrounding her. "The only time I felt the blood move in my veins was when I saw your name on a ticker tape. The only time I felt alive was when I was trying to figure out how to best you. Our rivalry wasn't business, Genevieve. It was my heartbeat. I didn't chase you for 20 years because I wanted your companies. I chased you because you were the only person on this planet who was as fierce, as lonely, and as brilliant as I was." Genevieve felt the wall inside her shudder. The suitcase handle felt heavy, an anchor she no longer wanted to carry. She looked at this man, this billionaire who was willing to lose his dynasty, this fencer who was laying down his sword, and she saw the truth. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I don't know how to be a we without losing the me." "Then we'll learn," he said, reaching out, his fingers finally brushing the silver hair at her temple. "We aren't children, Genevieve. We don't have to change who we are. We just have to stop fighting the only person who actually knows who we are." He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. "Don't get on that helicopter. Stay. Not for the merger, not for the consortium. Stay because I am 53 years old, and I finally found the woman I want to grow old with. And she's a lioness who deserves a king who isn't afraid of her teeth." Genevieve closed her eyes. The kingmaker felt the weight of the crown slip. She let go of the suitcase. The sound of it hitting the floor was the only surrender she would ever allow. She reached up, her hands cupping his face, her thumbs tracing the lines of age and wisdom she had come to crave. "If you ever make me feel like a foreign influence again, Dong-Wook, I will burn your shipping fleet to the ground." Dong-Wook let out a ragged, beautiful laugh and pulled her into him, crushing his lips to hers. "I would expect nothing less, my queen." Outside, the helicopter landed on the pad, its rotors spinning in vain. The lioness wasn't leaving. She was just beginning her reign. The peace of the Alps didn't break. It was detonated. It began at 6 a.m. with the synchronized, frantic chirping of encrypted devices. The blue light of Genevieve's tablet illuminated the darkened room, but the headline that stared back at her wasn't about the merger or the tech market. The sovereign affair, St. James and Lee, caught an alpine embrace. Below the headline was a grainier, long lens shot that felt like a violation of the soul. It wasn't a photo of two CEOs shaking hands. It was the moment after the fencing match. Both of them on the floor, masks off. Dong-Wook's hand cupping Genevieve's face, their expressions raw with a hunger that no board of directors could ever authorize. There were more. Them in the back of the car, silhouettes pressed together. Genevieve on the balcony in her silk robe, Dong-Wook standing just behind her, his chin resting on her shoulder. They had a drone, Genevieve whispered, her voice like ice. Even in a blizzard, they had a damn drone. Dong-Wook was already on his feet, his face pale but his eyes burning. He was scrolling through the Korean portals. The reaction in Seoul was catastrophic. The ideal son of the Shinhwa dynasty was trending alongside words like betrayal, scandal, and distraction. Shinhwa Group stock is down 8% in pre-market trading, Dong-Wook said, his voice a flat, dangerous monotone. The council is already releasing a statement. They're calling it unauthorized contact and manipulative optics by a foreign entity. Foreign entity? Genevieve stood up, the silk of her robe hissing. They're making me the villain? The black woman who seduced their golden boy into a lapse of judgment? They are protecting the brand, Genevieve, Dong-Wook said, looking at her with a pained intensity. And your board, look at the New York wires. Genevieve swiped her screen. Her own PR team was already drafting a denial. Miss St. James maintains a strictly professional relationship with Chairman Lee. The images have been taken out of context to damage a sensitive merger. The world was trying to force them back into their boxes. The ideal and the fierce were allowed to be titans, but they were not allowed to be human, not with each other. By noon, the estate felt like a command center under siege. The sovereign partnership was being pulled apart by two different continents. We have to deny it, Genevieve said, pacing the library. She was back in her armor, a white power suit that felt like a shroud. If we don't, the institutional investors will pull out. They don't want romance. They want stability. We tell them it was a tactical play to confuse the shorts. We tell them it was a staged leak. Dong-Wook sat at the oak table, his hands folded. He looked at the photo on his screen, the one of him holding her on the fencing mat. He didn't see a scandal. He saw the only moment in his 53 years where he had looked truly, terrifyingly happy. Is that what you want? He asked quietly. To call the best thing that has happened to us in 20 years a tactical play? I want to keep my company, Dong-Wook, Genevieve shouted, her composure finally snapping. I have spent my life making sure no one could use my personal life as a weapon against my professional excellence. If I let them win this, I'm just another headline. I'm not the lioness anymore. I'm a tabloid character. And if we deny it, Dong-Wook stood up, walking toward her, we become the ghosts again. We tell the world that they were right, that our love is a liability. We tell my mother and your board that they own our hearts as well as our shares. He stopped in front of her. The market is fluctuating because they are afraid of the unknown. So, let's give them a certainty. What are you saying? Lean in, he said, his eyes unfaltering. No more strictly professional statements. No more hiding in the mountains. We don't deny the photos. We claim them. Genevieve felt a rush of vertigo. That's corporate suicide. The Shinhwa Council will oust you by morning. Let them, Dong-Wook said, and for the first time, he looked completely at peace. I've spent so many years being the ideal son. I'd rather be the disgraced chairman who has the woman he loves than the king who has to lie about why he's smiling. He reached out, taking her hands in his. Genevieve, you are the queen of media. You control the narrative of the modern world. Why are you letting a tabloid dictate yours? If we stand together, not as business partners, but as a union, we don't just stabilize the market, we redefine it. Genevieve looked at him, her mind working at 1,000 miles an hour. She saw the risk. It was a billion-dollar gamble, but she also saw the man, the smart, strong, incredible man who was willing to set his world on fire just to hold her hand in the light. She felt the old, familiar heat of a boss move rising in her chest. Only this time, it wasn't for a merger. It was for her life. You're right, she whispered, a slow, predatory smile spreading across her lips. If they want a scandal, let's give them a revolution. 10 minutes later, the lioness went to work. She didn't call her PR team. She didn't call the board. She opened her own verified social media account, which reached 300 million people across the globe. She didn't post a statement. She posted a new photo. It was a selfie, taken moments ago in the Swiss sunlight. It showed her and Dong-Wook standing on the terrace, the mountains behind them. They weren't in suits. They were in sweaters, their shoulders touching, their hands intertwined. Dong-Wook was looking at the camera with a defiance that was breathtaking, and Genevieve was looking at him with a pride that could melt the glaciers. The caption was 3 words, "Our sovereign will." The internet didn't just break, it transformed. Within seconds, the narrative shifted from scandal to power couple of the century. The stock prices for St. James Media and Xinhua Group stopped dropping. They didn't just stabilize, they began to climb, fueled by the sheer, unadulterated confidence of 2 icons who refused to apologize for their humanity. Dong-Wook's phone rang. It was his mother. He looked at the caller ID, then looked at Genevieve. He didn't answer it. Instead, he turned the phone off and pulled Genevieve into his arms. "The market is open," he whispered against her hair. "Let it burn," Genevieve replied, holding him tighter. "We own the ashes." The silence of the Swiss morning was shattered by the high-pitched hum of a secure fax line. A sound Genevieve hadn't heard in years. It was followed immediately by a flurry of pings from Dong-Wook's encrypted terminal. The sovereign will post had worked on the public, but for the dinosaurs in the boardrooms of New York and the ancestral halls of Seoul, it was a declaration of war. "Emergency vote to remove the CEO," Genevieve read aloud, her voice tight, a cold smile touching her lips as she looked at her tablet. "Citing reckless endangerment of shareholder value and personal distraction. My own CFO signed the petition." Dong-Wook stood at the window, his phone pressed to his ear. He spoke in a clipped, lethal Korean, his eyes fixed on the snow. He hung up and turned to her. "The Xinhua Council has invoked the Hyo Clause, a traditional morality provision. They are attempting to freeze my voting block, claiming I am mentally incapacitated by foreign influence. My mother has already moved to appoint my cousin as interim chairman." They stood in the center of the library, 2 titans who had just been told their empires were no longer theirs. In the world of billion-dollar stakes, they were being treated like wayward children. "They think we're vulnerable because we're together," Genevieve said, dropping her tablet onto the oak table. She walked toward him, her movement fluid and predatory. She stopped inches from his chest, her eyes blazing with the fire of a woman who had fought for every inch of her ground. "They think we've gone soft in the mountains." Dong-Wook reached out, his hand settling on the nape of her neck, his thumb tracing the defiant line of her jaw. "They've forgotten who we were before we became icons. They think the ideal son and the lioness are just roles we play." "Let's remind them," Genevieve whispered. "I don't want to defend my chair, Dong-Wook. I want to burn theirs. You handle my board. I'll handle your council." "A cross-continental counterstrike," Dong-Wook said, a dark, appreciative glint in his eyes. You use the media to dismantle a dynasty. I use the markets to buy a board. Absolute synergy. For the next 4 hours, the Swiss estate became the most dangerous war room on the planet. Genevieve sat at the head of the table, 3 laptops open. She wasn't looking at stock prices. She was looking at archives. She called her lead investigative editor in London. "Open the Xinhua file," Genevieve commanded. "I want the tax evasion records from the 2014 Busan port deal. I want the mistress's payoffs, the offshore accounts in the Caymans, and the footage of the council's vice chair at the Macau casino. Leak it all. Not as a press release, but as a slow, agonizing drip through every major outlet in Asia. If they want to talk about morality, let's show the world theirs." Across the room, Dong-Wook was a silent ghost of destruction. He was on a private line with a consortium of shadow lenders in Singapore. "I need the debt profiles of the St. James Media board members," he said, his voice as smooth as silk and as sharp as a razor. "The chairman, Arthur Vance. He has a massive margin loan against his personal estate in the Hamptons. Buy it. All of it. The CFO's daughter's tech startup. Buy the Series B lead, then threaten to pull the funding by noon if he doesn't rescind his signature on the petition." He wasn't just defending Genevieve. He was decapitating her opposition. He was using his billions not as a shield, but as a wrecking ball. The showdown, 2 p.m. Central European Time. The dual-screen video conference was set. On the left, the stone-faced elders of the Xinhua Council sat in a mahogany-lined room in Seoul. On the right, the terrified board members of St. James Media sat in a glass and steel tower in Manhattan. Genevieve and Dong-Wook stood together in front of the camera. They weren't wearing masks. They weren't hiding. Genevieve wore a suit of brilliant, aggressive crimson. Dong-Wook was in a black suit that looked like armor. "Gentlemen," Genevieve began, her voice a low, melodic threat that traveled across the Atlantic. "And I use the term loosely. I understand there is a vote on the floor for my removal. Genevieve, this distraction in the Alps," Arthur Vance started, his voice shaking. The optics, Dong-Wook interrupted, his English cold and precise, "are that you are currently 3 minutes away from a total personal bankruptcy, Arthur. I now own the debt on your home, your yacht, and your wife's charitable foundation. If that vote proceeds, I will call those loans before the markets close." The Manhattan screen went dead silent. Arthur Vance's face turned the color of ash. Genevieve turned her gaze to the Xinhua Council. She spoke through a live translator, but her eyes needed no translation. "And to the council in Seoul, you've spent the morning calling me a foreign influence. Meanwhile, the New York Times is currently uploading a 3-part expose on the vice chairman's money laundering in Macau. It seems the Ideal family has a very dirty basement." She leaned into the camera, her presence filling the screens in both hemispheres. "You think you can oust us because we found each other? You think our power is tied to our titles? We are the power. Without us, Xinhua is a crumbling relic, and St. James is a hollow shell. If you proceed with these votes, we will both resign. We will take our intellectual property, our proprietary algorithms, and our top 500 clients, and we will start a new entity by sunset." "You wouldn't," the vice chairman stammered in Korean. "I have already drafted the articles of incorporation," Dong-Wook said, his hand sliding into Genevieve's, their fingers locking on camera. "It's called Sovereign Will Holdings, and our first act will be a hostile takeover of both your companies with the very capital you tried to freeze." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of men who had realized they had brought knives to a nuclear launch. "I suggest," Genevieve said, her voice dropping to a predatory purr, "that you all take the next 5 minutes to reconsider your positions. Arthur, I expect your resignation as chairman by the time I finish my tea. Vice chairman, I suggest you retire to your country estate before the prosecutor's office knocks on your door." She reached out and cut the feed. The room returned to the quiet of the mountains. The blue light of the monitors flickered out. Genevieve leaned against the table, the adrenaline finally ebbing, leaving behind a fierce, triumphant heat. Dong-Wook turned her toward him, his hand sliding into her hair. "The kingmaker and the king," he murmured, his forehead resting against hers. "We didn't just protect the legacies," Genevieve breathed, her heart hammering against his chest. "We evolved them." "They'll hate us for this," Dong-Wook said, his lips brushing hers. "The world doesn't like it when the Titans stop playing by the rules." "Then let them hate us," Genevieve replied, pulling him closer. "As long as they fear us, and as long as I have you, I don't care about the rules." In the high, thin air of the Alps, the two most powerful people in the world didn't look like CEOs. They looked like victors. They had used their empires to save their love, and in doing so, they had become untouchable. The mountain residency ended not with a whimper, but with the silent, heavy clicking of two briefcases. The Swiss estate, which had witnessed the dismantling of their defenses and the restructuring of their souls, stood cold and brutalist against the retreating snow. They left separately. Optics, after all, were the currency of the powerful. Genevieve flew west, back to the steel canyons of Manhattan. Dong-Wook flew east, toward the neon-soaked gravity of Seoul. For 3 weeks, the world watched their stock tickers, looking for signs of the scandal to resurface. But there was only silence, the kind of silence that precedes a tectonic shift. London, 2 weeks later. The rain over the Thames was a familiar charcoal gray, the same color it had been in 1998. Genevieve stood on the Millennium Bridge, the wind whipping her coat around her legs. She wasn't hiding. She wore a coat of deep royal sapphire, her hair silvered and sharp, her presence stopping the breath of tourists who didn't know her name but recognized her power. A footsteps approached, rhythmic and steady. She didn't have to turn around. She knew the cadence of his walk. She knew the way his energy felt against her back, a solid, unyielding force. Dong-Wook leaned against the railing beside her. He looked older, perhaps, or maybe just lighter. The ideal sun mask had been discarded in the Alps, replaced by the face of a man who had looked into the abyss of his own legacy and decided he wanted more. "The council attempted to vote again this morning," Dong-Wook said, his voice a low vibration against the London fog. "They wanted me to sign a morality clause. I told them I would rather burn Xinhua to the ground and build a park on its ashes." Genevieve smiled, a slow, dangerous curve of her lips. "My board sent me a bouquet of lilies, a peace offering. I sent them back with a note. I don't accept apologies and flowers. I accept them in equity." They looked out over the river, the water churning below. In the real world, people like them were supposed to retire. They were supposed to fade into the background, becoming emeritus legends, while the youth took the spoils. "I'm not moving to Seoul, Dong-Wook," Genevieve said, her voice clear. "I have no interest in being a chairman's wife. I don't do tea ceremonies, and I don't play second." "And I," Dong-Wook replied, turning to her, his dark eyes reflecting the city lights, "have no intention of moving to New York to be your consort. I'm a man of the East. My roots are deep, even if I have pruned the branches." The confession hung in the air, the brutal reality of two people who were too big to fit into a single life. "So," Genevieve whispered, "we don't move in. We don't retire. We don't shrink." "No," Dong-Wook agreed. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, encrypted drive. "We form a new jurisdiction, a sovereign will, off the books, an alliance of our private assets, moved through a series of trusts in Singapore and Zurich. We don't merge our companies, Genevieve. We merge our shadows." Genevieve took the drive, her fingers brushing his. The contact sent a jolt of electricity through her that 20 years of corporate victories couldn't match. A secret empire. We remain titans in public, but in private, we are the only ones who know where the true bodies are buried. It's more than an empire, Genevieve, Dong-Wook said, stepping into her space, his hand rising to cup her jaw. It's the end of the loneliness. I don't need you to live in my house. I just need you to be the one I call when the world is too small for me. Genevieve leaned into his touch, her eyes closing. At 55, she had realized the ultimate truth of their tax bracket. Love wasn't about sharing a kitchen. It was about sharing a vision. It was about having one person on the planet who could look at your scars and your crown and not be intimidated by either. I see you, Dong-Wook, she breathed. I have always seen you, Genevieve, he replied. Brussels, 3 months later. The International Tech and Media Summit was the largest gathering of global influence in the decade. The world's cameras were trained on the massive mahogany doors of the Grand Hall. The rumors had been swirling for months of a secret alliance, of a new power dynamic that was rewriting the rules of the global market. The door swung open. Genevieve St. James stepped through first. She was a vision in a structured gold-threaded suit that shimmered like armor. She looked like the sun. Beside her, his stride perfectly synchronized with hers, was Lee Dong-Wook. He was in a black tuxedo of such impeccable tailoring, he looked like a shadow cast by her light. They didn't walk a respectful distance apart. They didn't play the game of professional associates. They walked hand in hand. Their fingers were locked. A black woman from the Bronx who had built a throne out of glass, and a Korean man from Busan who had turned a dynasty into a revolution. As they moved down the center aisle, the room went silent. It wasn't just the wealth they represented. It was the parity. They reached the head of the long conference table, where the most powerful men in Europe and Asia sat waiting. Genevieve didn't wait for a chair to be pulled out. Dong-Wook didn't wait for permission to speak. They took their seats at the head of the table, side by side. Genevieve looked around the room, her gaze steady, her presence a physical weight. She felt Dong-Wook's hand squeeze hers beneath the table, a private, sovereign pact. The world had tried to tell them they were too old for a new beginning. It had tried to tell them they were too powerful to be vulnerable. But as Genevieve looked into the lenses of 100 cameras, she realized that they had just executed the ultimate power move. They weren't just bosses, they were equals. Gentlemen, Genevieve said, her voice echoing with the authority of a woman who finally had nothing to hide. Shall we begin? 1 year later, the Aegean Sea was a sheet of hammered silver under the low-hanging moon. On a private island off the coast of Santorini, an island that didn't appear on commercial maps, the villa known as the Obsidian stood as a monument to silence. Genevieve St. James sat on the edge of an infinity pool that seemed to spill directly into the stars. She wore a caftan of hand-painted silk, her feet bare, a glass of vintage Japanese whiskey sweating on the stone beside her. At 56, the lioness had traded some of her roar for a deep, resonant hum of contentment. But her eyes were still on a tablet. Even here, the world didn't stop. You promised the devices would be off by midnight, Genevieve. The voice was like velvet over gravel. Dong-Wook stepped out from the shadows of the villa. He was dressed in linen trousers and nothing else, his tan skin glowing in the moonlight, the lean muscle of his torso a testament to his daily fencing bouts. He looked younger, the tension that had once lived in his shoulders now replaced by the predatory ease of a man who no longer had anything to prove. I'm watching the Nigerian tech surge, Genevieve said, not looking up, though her lips curved. Our secret sovereign fund just cleared a 40% return in the third quarter. We're officially outperforming our own public companies. Dong-Wook? Dong-Wook walked behind her, his hand settling on her shoulders. His touch was no longer a surprise. It was an anchor. He leaned down, his breath hot against her ear. We are on a private island for our anniversary. The world can survive without your oversight for 6 hours. He reached down, took the tablet from her hands, and set it on the table. Then, he turned her around to face him. "You're a very bossy man, Lee Dong-Wook," she murmured, her arms sliding up to drape over his shoulders. "I'm a man who knows the value of his assets," he replied, pulling her flush against him, "and you are the only one that matters." Their life over the past year had become a masterpiece of logistical genius. They didn't live together. The world was their home. They met in Paris for strategy sessions that lasted 3 days and involved very little talking. They met in Tokyo for board meetings that ended in secret dinners in hidden gardens. They lived in the sovereign will, a private, untouchable space they had carved out of the chaos of their empires. The public is still obsessed over them. Every time they were photographed together, the markets shifted. They had become the blueprint for a new kind of power, the unbound union. "I saw the news from Seoul," Genevieve said, her voice dropping as she looked into his eyes. "Your mother stepped down from the family council. She's officially retired to the Jeju estate." "She realized that she couldn't fight a ghost," Dong-Wook said, a touch of somber victory in his voice, "and she certainly couldn't fight you. She told my cousin that you were the most terrifying woman she had ever had the displeasure of respecting." Genevieve laughed, the sound rich and genuine. "I'll take it. It's the highest compliment a woman like her can give." "And you're bored?" "They've stopped asking me about distractions," Genevieve said, her fingers tracing the faint scar on his shoulder from an old fencing injury. "They realize that when I'm happy, the share price stays in the green. It turns out love is the ultimate hedge against volatility." Dong-Wook picked up his own glass, offering it to her. They shared a sip, the smoke and peat of the whiskey warming them. "Do you regret it?" he asked, his gaze becoming intensely focused. "The noise? The scandal? The fact that we can never just be normal?" Genevieve looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the smart, strong, formidable man who had chased her across 2 decades of boardrooms just to find his match. She saw the man who had seen her at her most ruthless and loved her for it. "Normal is for people who are afraid of the heights, Dong-Wook," she said, her voice steady and fierce. "I spent 55 years being the only one, being the first. I don't want normal. I want this. I want the only person in the world who isn't afraid to look me in the eye when I'm winning." Dong-Wook set the glass down and swept her up into his arms, carrying her toward the villa. The lioness didn't protest. She leaned her head against his chest, listening to the steady, powerful rhythm of his heart. The world would wake up tomorrow. There would be markets to conquer, rivals to dismantle, and legacies to protect. They would return to their separate corners of the globe, back to the boss personas that the public demanded. But tonight, in the silver light of the Aegean, they were just 2 people who had finally realized that the greatest power move isn't owning the world. It's being truly seen by the one person who owns your heart. As they entered the darkened bedroom, the tablet on the table flickered one last time with a notification of another billion-dollar gain. Neither of them looked back. The end. Thank you for watching. If you loved this story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more emotional twists and character-driven plots. And if you're ready for the next story, make sure to turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Until next time, keep believing in love that defies all odds.